Hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to our Zoom dinners. Tonight, we have a very special guest and a friend, Jamie Raskin. I want to begin by giving my condolences to you and your family, Jamie, on the loss of Tommy. So it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for taking the time.
The pleasure is all mine to be with you, and thank you for your support and your kind words about Tommy, who, of course, was the biggest Busboys and Poets fanatic in the world, and did poetry there and hung out there and knew all of your great workers. And so we mostly, of course, hung out in the Tacoma Busboys, but he was pretty much all over the map. And I think he even told me that you were going to Baltimore. I think that's where I learned it, that you were going to go to Baltimore. So.
Well, his spirit lives on among all of us. I want to take a moment to introduce you, Jamie, for those of you that may not know all about you. Jamie Raskin is a congressman, of course, from the 8th Congressional District in Maryland. He is serving the third term. He just got reelected for third term. Prior to that, he was a state senator in Maryland, professor of law at American University. He is the author of several books, including the best-selling Overruling Democracy, the Supreme Court versus the American People. He's also a graduate of Harvard Law School. I wanted to ask you, Jamie, to begin with, it is Harvard Law School, the same law school that also graduated Ted Cruz, Mark Pompeo, Alan Dershowitz, Tom Cotton, and many others. You're very different from those folks. You studied in the same halls, probably in some cases had the same professors. How is it that you all see things so differently? Can you please help?
First, let me say about Dershowitz, who has become just an egregious thorn in the side of democracy. I don't think he actually went to Harvard Law School. I think he went to Yale Law School, but he was certainly a professor there for a long time. He was my professor.
Okay.
I had him for criminal law, but I also had Larry Tribe, who has been a great defender of our democracy against all of this right-wing insurrectionism and fascism running amok in the Republic. I think that Harvard Law School is kind of overblown in the sense that it's a big place and people kind of get out of it what they want to get out of it. And if you want to go, as Tommy Raskin did, to become a human rights and an animal rights and animal welfare lawyer, you can find the people there to work with. And of course, if you want to go to become a right-wing corporate hack and a polemicist like Dershowitz for reaction, you can find a lot of professors there to work with too. So it's a big place, and different things are going on.
Yeah. You're entering your third term right now in Congress. Are you still having a good time?
Well, as you know, Andy, I mean, it's been a rough several months. We lost Tommy on the last day of 2020, New Year's Eve day, and that plunged us into a pretty deep agony and grief. Then a week later, I was on the House floor helping lead with Nancy Pelosi the opposition to the GOP objections to electoral college votes being counted from Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania. They had a plan to try to rebuff those electors, deny Biden his majority, and then throw the election into a so-called contingent presidential election under the 12th Amendment. That would have allowed them to enter a vote, not according to one member, one vote, but one state, one vote. And there, because of the relative prevalence of Republican states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Alaska, and so on, they would have beaten us 27, 22 to 21. And it was really only, the courage of the Capitol officers, the members who refused this, and then Mike Pence refusing to go along with their plan. I mean, they wanted Mike Pence just to pronounce that these electoral college slates were going to be rejected, unilaterally asserting authority the vice president's never had before, but they wanted him to do it. And then they unleashed that mob to try to force him to do it and to force the Congress to go along. So anyway, I got caught up in that. And our daughter Tabitha was there, and our son-in-law Hank was there. And so that was a nightmare. Then because of Trump's incitement of that violent insurrection, Speaker Pelosi had asked me to be the lead manager and to organize the team of managers in impeachment. And that was a very intense period for me, a very intense period, but it was one that I think was fruitful in that we convicted him in the court of public opinion. We convicted him in the court of history. We created a meticulous documentary record that will always exist of his mobilization of violent elements, extreme right-wing elements, to attack Congress and overthrow the 2020 election. And although he beat the constitutional spread, we didn't make it to 2/3. We had robust concurrent majorities in the House and the Senate to impeach and convict him. And it was the most bipartisan impeachment vote in American history by far. There have only been 4 impeachment trials, Andy. One was Andrew Johnson, one was Bill Clinton, which was absurd, of course, and then Trump 1 and Trump 2. That's it. And ours was by far the most sweeping bipartisan statement of a president's guilt in the history of our country. So basically, I mean, it's been a very tough time, but I would say up until then, I mean, I love my job. I've got the most incredible constituents in the world in Montgomery County and Frederick County and Carroll County, and a very engaged, active citizenry that gets behind me on everything from, the American Rescue Act to infrastructure investment to sweeping climate change legislation to DC statehood, which I brought to the floor yesterday with Eleanor Holmes Norton. I fight for a strong, true blue progressive agenda. And so I feel great about that. But it is a frustrating situation with these people. And they brought us some very dark times, as you know.
What is your sense of what's going to happen in the midterm? There's all kinds of rumblings about, the midterm is going to turn around. Is it just normal American politics where, the pendulum swings one side, then swings the other, swings back and forth and so on. And it takes forever for it to move,
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to stop the pendulum and push it back in a progressive direction. It's true that presidents always see congressional losses in the midterm. I mean, that is the historical pattern. And that's not even our biggest problem. Our biggest problem is that the Republican state legislatures, which gerrymander themselves into power every 10 years, also gerrymander us into oblivion in the U.S. House. And so we're in a redistricting year. We've tried to get rid of that through H.R. 1 to move to independent redistricting commissions in every state in the union to end gerrymandering. And of course, the GOP refuses to move on it. I mean, it's the gerrymander over principal party. That's what GOP stands for right now. So that's what we're up against. On the other hand, we are proving to America that in democracy, the government can be, must be, should be an instrument of the common good, an instrument of the public interest. And so we came in, we did that $1.9 trillion American Rescue Act to rescue the states and the counties and the cities and the towns, to infuse money into the public school systems so we can get the kids back to school safely, to get unemployment compensation to people, because a lot of people are living on the edge. As you know, small business PPP money to keep small businesses, including the restaurant sector, going, revitalize the public health infrastructure, and then create the first nationwide plan to really crush and destroy COVID-19. The virus, I mean, Trump had put us on the edge of becoming a failed state. A failed state is a state that can't deliver the basic goods of existence to the people. And Trump's own COVID-19 team has said since he left office, we lost hundreds of thousands of Americans unnecessarily because of their lethal recklessness and negligence and all of his fake miracle cures and all that stuff. So we're showing that government can work for the people. And we're doing it on public health. We're doing it in infrastructure. We're doing it with voting rights, our HR 1, to have universal automatic voter registration across the country to defeat these voter suppression bills, 350 of them across the country. So I think that we're showing that government can work again. That is the best answer to what we've just come out of. And if we keep doing that, and if we can actually defend our people's right to vote and turn out the vote, we should have sweeping victories in 2022. But it's going to be a real fight. I mean, Donald Trump has been made a pariah in the national political culture, but he is still the cult hero in the religious cult of personality that has become the Republican Party. And, they're down there in Mar-a-Lago right now, Andy. Everybody who he pardoned, Steve Bannon and Dinesh D'Souza and Roger Stone, all of those political criminals, okay, who he pardoned are down there, and they're working to bring him back. They're seeking the big restoration of power. And every autocrat, theocrat, dictator, kleptocrat, tyrant, despot on earth who he made pals with, they're going to be behind him again. Mm-hmm. Putin and Orban and El-Sisi and Duterte and Netanyahu and you name it, all of them are going to be lining up for Donald Trump again. Why? It will destroy American democracy. We barely survived 4 years of that right-wing authoritarianism. And imagine what it would mean if he were actually to get back into power. And we would never get him out. He's made it very clear. What he's out there saying now about January 6th is, my people entered hugging and kissing the Capitol officers. That's what he said. Mm. Yeah, not the 140 of them who ended up in the hospital with injuries, not the ones who lost fingers, who got their eyes gouged out, not the ones who had a heart attack, not Officer Sicknick. No, I don't think they were hugging and kissing. Mm-hmm. But this is the right-wing whitewash and the revisionism that you're going to start to hear. And we're hearing it from Republicans in Congress, too.
And yet, I think despite all of this, we saw that during the last election. I mean, I have never seen more negative coverage against the president in my lifetime, certainly. And yet, despite all that, we lost seats in the House.
Yes.
What do you attribute that to?
Well, the simple answer, which captures not all of it, but a lot of it, is that we had a fantastic year in 2018. We won more than 40 seats. It was incredible. And that's an amazing class of people that brought in, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib and Connor Lamb and,
Ilhan Omar.
Yeah. Amazing people from all over the country, right? But we won a lot of swing districts there. And that was an off year. Trump wasn't on the ballot. In 2020, Trump was on the ballot, and he brought out those right-wing Republican surge voters. They came back. Millions of people went back to the polls, and it washed out a lot of our people who were in those close districts. That's how we lost so many of them. But we've got a razor-thin majority now, but we are going to be mobilizing with everything we've got this year and next year. My Democracy Summer Project, which has done a lot of stuff at Busboys, which started in Maryland. We've had over 1,000 young people spend the summer with us studying the history of social change, the tactics of political organizing, and then getting involved in campaigns. And we've been in Pennsylvania, we've been in Virginia, in Jersey, we've been all over the Mid-Atlantic. Well, we're going nationwide this summer. We're going to have a nationwide Democracy Summer outreach, and we're going to mobilize the young people to get registered and to become, a serious force in the 2022 elections.
I want to talk about elections, and specifically, I want to talk about the DC statehood. I know we just dropped the bill in yesterday with Eleanor Holmes Norton. I know that This has been a conversation that's being had all over the country. I am out here. I was out here in Arizona, and I'm at a coffee shop, and somebody says, "Where are you from?" And I said, "From DC." And they said, "Oh, you statehood." So it used to be. I remember we did a poll one time. I was on DC Vote, and like 85% of the country had no idea that the DC folks couldn't vote in for their own Congress person or senator. And so it's interesting. That's become much more commonplace. People really recognize and know that there's an issue and there's a problem that needs to be righted. I know you've talked a lot about statehood. You've quoted de Tocqueville about democracy and expanding democracy and all of that. But in 2009, we had the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and it never went through. DC statehood did not go through at that time. What do you have more hope this time? Do you think we have more of a chance? What should people be looking for at this point vis-a-vis DC statehood?
Well, you're right. I mean, the real transformation here has been within the Democratic Party. Because I think that Eleanor got a majority of Democrats, but not a big majority back in 1993, and she only got one Republican, Wayne Gilchrist, from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and so it was defeated 2-1. But we got all the Democrats this time. We got no Republicans, but we got all the Democrats, and people understand it is a fundamental issue about political rights and civil rights. It's also about democratic self-government. And are people going to have the right to govern themselves on an equal basis? I mean, this is how you attain to political equality in the United States of America. We've added 37 states since the original 13. And so DC is doing what 37 other states did. And all of those states faced the same kinds of ludicrous constitutional objections that have been leveled against people in Washington now. I mean, it was said Hawaii and Alaska, of course, could not be admitted to the Union because they weren't contiguous with the mainland. And Texas, no way could that be admitted because it had been its own republic. And where did Congress get the power to admit a foreign country as a state? And Utah was obviously a theocracy because it was majority Mormon, and the Mormon church had way too much power, and on and on. So, I told my Republican colleagues, you guys might think that you're really clever in wrapping your obviously political partisan objections in constitutional clothing, but you're just treading in the steps of the traditional enemies of other people's political equality. And that's all they're doing. I said, really, you'd be much smarter to take seriously your own platform, which has called for Puerto Rican statehood since 1940. And every 4 years since then, they've called for statehood for Puerto Rico, except 2020. You know why? They didn't have a platform in 2020. Their platform was whatever Donald Trump said. I mean, demonstrating their absolute descent into being a religious cult. But in any event, they've claimed that they're for Puerto Rican statehood. The Puerto Rican, what they call their delegate is the resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez. She's a Republican, and she's the one who's introducing statehood for Puerto Rico. So they should live up to their own commitments, and they can hate DC all they want. They should make a trade, just like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, just like the Missouri Compromise with Missouri and Maine, just like Hawaii and Alaska coming in like that, just like Kentucky and Vermont. I mean, it has been that kind of sectional and political compromise that's been the bread and butter of statehood admissions. Most states have entered the Union like animals boarding Noah's Ark. They come on in twosies. So bring it on. If they're serious about Puerto Rico, or if they can't stand the idea of having, Spanish-speaking senators, non-white senators, well, then they should tell that to America, but it's been in their platform. So now is the time for them to show they're interested in common ground and, creating real political compromise.
A lot of people that object to it on constitutional grounds. I know you're a constitutional lawyer. You know your stuff really well. You've impressed people throughout, certainly during the impeachment and other times. People saw your brilliance. And I want to be able to say, I know George Will wrote an article today in the Washington Post where he objects to statehood based on a constitutional glitch. And so can you explain to us the argument, the constitutional argument for it and against it?
Yes. Well, First of all, the Constitution should be used to clarify things and to educate people, not to confuse people and not to propagandize people the way that the Republicans have used it. But look, the Congress of the United States has the exclusive power under Article 4, Section 3 to admit new states to the Union. This is the admissions clause and the admissions power. There has never been an admission of a state to the Union that has been struck down by the Supreme Court or any other court. It's what the courts themselves call a political question, by which they mean it is a non-reviewable subject up to the congressional branch, up to the legislative branch to decide. It's not for the courts to decide. It's up to Congress. Congress has the authority to admit new states, and it has the responsibility to guarantee a, quote, Republican form of government to all of the people of the country. And here we don't mean a Republican Party form of government. We mean a Republican form of government in the sense of a representative form of government. So I think that Eleanor Holmes Norton was right to say there's a moral obligation, at the very least, if not a constitutional obligation, to extend statehood to more than 700,000 tax-paying draftable American citizens in Washington who have exercised their rights under the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution to organize into a state to petition for admission. Okay, so that's the real standard. They say, well, DC can't, the people of DC cannot negotiate an exodus from the federal district by shrinking the boundaries. And they make two arguments. One, they say you can't change the boundaries of the district. There are two insuperable problems for that argument. One is that the text of the Constitution says that Congress shall exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over the district that's to become the seat of government. What that means is that exclusive legislation in all cases doesn't mean legal cases. It means on all issues. So it says right there, Congress can control the boundaries of the district. And the history is Congress has altered and modified the boundaries of the district. It did it in 1791, shortly after the original session. James Madison and other framers of the Constitution themselves changed the boundaries after it was originally set. And then even more convincingly, in 1846, Congress voted to take 1/3 of the federal district, Alexandria, Arlington, parts of Fairfax County, and give them back to Virginia. Now, if Congress had no authority to control the boundaries of the district and to alter it, it couldn't have done that. But it did do that. Now, some of my Republican colleagues were claiming yesterday, when I raised them, that it was unconstitutional for them to do it. Okay, so they claim Alexandria and Arlington are now unconstitutionally composed as part of Virginia, which just underscores it's a political question. It's up to Congress. The courts are not going to interfere with that. Their other argument is about the 23rd Amendment, adopted in 1961, not to disenfranchise people in Washington, but to give people in Washington the right to vote in presidential elections. It obviously did not go all the way to congressional representation and democratic self-government. But they say Congress cannot admit a new state to the Union, redraw the boundaries of the district and admit the new state, as long as the 23rd Amendment is there. Why not? Because they say then the president and the president's family, 5 people or whatever, would have 3 electoral college votes. They would get all of the presidential electors for the District of Columbia. Well, there's several problems with their argument. The first one, which is just a knockout argument, is that Eleanor Holmes Norton in her legislation, which I've been working on with her for years, okay, takes care of the problem. It says the moment that the new state is admitted, Washington, Douglas Commonwealth, immediately the Electoral College statute, there's a federal law that organizes the electors for DC, will be repealed. So once it's repealed, it's no threat to anybody. And then Eleanor has said she will be the first one to say, let's introduce a constitutional amendment that will be the fastest sailing constitutional amendment in history to repeal the 23rd Amendment, because it's just, at that point, it's just flotsam and jetsam sitting in the Constitution. We don't need it anymore. It's like prohibition. We can just repeal it. We don't need it. The final problem is that even if they don't believe that federal statute can work, there's no reason it shouldn't work, even if they believe all of the states would say, no, we want the president and his family or her family to have 3 electoral college votes, which none would. You can't find a single person who says that. Even if all that happened, it wouldn't make statehood for Washington, D.C. unconstitutional. It would just accomplish this absurd and ridiculous result, but it wouldn't stop 712,000 people from having their political equality. So that's the kind of nonsense they've been saying, Andy. I mean, they were actually raising arguments like DC doesn't have auto dealerships. And I went and got Don Beyer, who owns Don Beyer of Volvo, or his family owns. I said, aren't there auto dealerships in DC? He said, yeah, there are auto dealerships in DC. They're my competitors. Well, so I think they disproved that when they were saying stuff like there's no landfill in Washington. And one of my wonderful new colleagues, Mondaire Jones, got up and said, with all of the racist trash you guys are putting out on the floor of the House today, you need a landfill.
and then there is always the argument that we'd be absorbed by Maryland and we can have a vote there. And as much as we love Maryland, we're not Marylanders.
Well, and that's the whole thing. I mean, they're right that conceptually it could happen. There's one problem: the people in DC haven't asked for that. The people of DC want statehood. And they keep saying, give Maryland their land back. And I'm saying Maryland hasn't asked for our land back. We gave it to the federal government in fee simple, absolutely, irrevocably. It went to the federal government. The federal government, Congress, can do with it what we please in responding to a statehood drive. And so it's like what you were mentioning about Tocqueville. We got to get back on the trajectory of democratic expansion, rather than this shriveling away of democracy. That's the big struggle in the country right now.
I want to switch a little bit to some local stuff some domestic stuff, immigration. I know that you've been talking a lot about immigration. You introduced the Access to Counsel Act and No Ban Act and all of these very important acts that help with us being more of a democracy and really the beacon for the rest of the world in many ways. How close are we to a comprehensive immigration reform policy? I mean, we keep sort of just kicking this can down the road every time we turn around, and yet we need to do something. We are a country of immigrants, and we need to address that issue once and for all. How close are we in coming to that?
Well, we're certainly much closer than we were under Trump, because we've got narrow, razor-thin concurrent majorities in the House and the Senate that want to do it, and we've got a president who wants to do it. So we're the closer than we've been in a long time. But with the filibuster still out there, we're in some sense as far as ever and more frustrated than ever, because what we're bumping into now is all of these undemocratic levers that the Republicans use to thwart progress in America. I mean, if you think about how the Republican Party survives, remember, Biden beat Trump by more than 7 million votes. It was 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, which Trump had declared a landslide when he beat Hillary by the exact same numbers last time. And yet the Republicans seem to have enough power to paralyze us on any big issue. Take gun violence, where 95% of Americans favor our legislation to impose a violent criminal background check on the sale of all firearms. I mean, it's just so obvious. It's staring us in the face, and our people are getting slaughtered every day, but the Republicans don't want it. How do they stop us? The filibuster. The filibuster. When I was over in the Senate on the impeachment trial, Andy, one thing I learned really struck me. There are 50 Democrats, there are 50 Republicans. The Democrats represent more than 40 million more people than the Republicans. I mean, the Republicans, they've got Nebraska and Montana and North Dakota and South Dakota. The Democrats are representing like Illinois, California, New York, New Jersey. And so the population imbalance alone makes it hugely disproportionate politically. And that's only thinking in terms of majority, like getting 51 to 49, right? But when you say we got to get 60 votes because of the Electoral College, at that point, I haven't done the math, but it's something like 75 or 80 million more Americans are represented in the number of senators you've got to get in order to get through a filibuster block. I mean, that's incredible. The way that a minority of the country, driven by corporate dark money and the gerrymandering of our elections and the suppression of voters, is able to dictate to the vast majority of the country our destiny. It just can't continue like this.
The idea of there's so many issues that we don't agree on as Americans. It seems like, I don't know how many, 70 million or so voted for Donald Trump and feel very strongly about him and want to see the country moving in the direction he was promoting. How do we come together as a country? You've been one of those legislators that have been really kind of able to bring people from different sides of the aisle together. Not many are able to do that, and I'm not sure how successful you've been in Congress itself to do that on a much bigger scale. What is your outlook in where we are as a country?
Well, look, we're bringing people together around issues. Okay, the vast majority of the country in every party supports a universal background check to stop violent criminals and other people who shouldn't have access to guns from getting them. Right? We organize. The vast majority of the country supports us on everything that people said we couldn't do before, like marriage equality. You remember, Andy, back when I ran for the state Senate, and you were like my biggest supporter when it first started. And I had no support. I was talking about marriage equality, and everybody said, don't talk about that. Like, that's never going to happen. It makes you sound like you're really extreme. You're not in the political center. And that's when I said, hey, it's not my ambition to be in the political center. It's my ambition to be in the moral center. I want to find what's right and bring the political center to us. Because if you go looking for the political center, you're just going to blow with the wind, But I think that that's what's working for Biden. Biden said, okay, I know that these people in Washington, who, by the way, have no platform. 2020 was an extraordinary year for a lot of reasons. One of them was that it was the first time in the history of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party that one of the major parties did not have a platform. They had no platform from their convention, which means their platform was Donald Trump. Whatever he said. Again, that's a religious cult. That's not a modern political party, So anyway,
what do you mean they didn't have a platform? There was no platform? The party had no platform?
They had no platform.
That doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make any sense.
That's what parties do. They put together a platform. They may not, stick with it, but platforms.
Well, the problem is that, look, and I've seen this over the last several years. If Donald Trump woke up and he said, the dictator of North Korea is our best friend, then he's our best friend, and they all go with it. If they say we're going to nuclear war against the dictator of North Korea, then we're going to nuclear war, and they go with that. It's they're like in Jim Jones and People's Baptist Temple Church. I've said before to the Republicans, I'm like, you guys are going to be fit for just selling flowers and incense at the airport when this is all over. They've totally dropped any critical thinking skills that they have.
Wow. Where are we with the Green New Deal?
Well, we're in a great place in terms of the Democrats. I think that look, we've got to do infrastructure, which is a massive jobs program for America, and these are not jobs that can be shipped overseas and ripped off by merging and acquiring corporations. It's going to be a huge jobs program for America, and it's going to be a green infrastructure plan. That right now is the soul of the Democratic Party commitment. What's interesting, Andy, is a lot of people thought when our margins got real narrow, it was going to be impossible to keep us together. It's had the reverse effect. There's a lot of focus, and I think the Democratic Party is discovering and rediscovering its progressive roots. And Joe Biden is starting to look a lot like Franklin D. Roosevelt in terms of the scale of his ambition for what he wants to do for the American economy, the American society, and for the environment. I mean, to lay out that we're going to cut carbon emissions by 50% by 2030, 8 years from now, or 9 years from now. I mean, that's very ambitious, and it's sweeping. And it's basically what, Mike Tidwell and Bill McKibben and, our climate change leaders have been demanding.
I want to move, well, before we move on international stuff, I wanted to ask you, what is your most pressing agenda right now in Congress that you want to tell people and have them support you, back you, make phone calls, write letters, whatever it takes? Well, what is the most important thing on your agenda at this point?
Well, the way I see it is everything is linked together by the democracy issues, right? I mean, you can't vote climate if you can't vote. You can't vote reproductive freedom if you can't vote. You can't vote political reform if you can't vote in the elections we've got now. And so, I mean, I think that's got to be the center of gravity. We've got to defend everybody's right to vote, both legislatively, through H.R. 1, through the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, through through D.C. statehood and Puerto Rican statehood. We've got to defend people's right to be represented and to vote fully. And then we have to actually go out and defend people's right to vote too, practically in the real world. I'd like to be able to say that, we not only convicted Trump in the court of public opinion, but we convicted him and said that he could never run again. But we didn't. We didn't get the 2/3 required there. We ended in a sort of ambiguous place, which is why he's still out there. I think he will destroy the Republican Party, but only if we put so much pressure and so much organizing out there that the political conflict within the Republican Party becomes untenable between those who say we've got to rejoin the civilized political discourse versus those who say, no, let's stay on the path of magical thinking and paranoid conspiracy theory and racism and nativism and anti-Semitism and so on. But we saw the face of that, Andy, on January 6th, up close and personal. That was no joke what they did. To have 40 or 50,000 people come in to try to overthrow the election and to reinstall Donald Trump as president. That is what we're up against. I don't want anybody to forget for 1 minute that right-wing authoritarianism is what we're up against.
Let me switch a little bit to the international front. I know that oftentimes we're so, stuck in issues that we have to deal with here, right in our backyard. We forget there's a world out there that we have had a huge impact on and continue to have an impact on. I know that the Biden administration is reviewing the amount of money that Saudi Arabia gets from us, and they're trying to tie it to the humanitarian disaster in Yemen. Where does Congress stand on that issue, and how much leverage does Congress have in being able to really kind of avert this continuous humanitarian disaster that's taking place right before our very eyes today?
Again, on the House side, I think we got a commanding majority that has opposed all of the atrocities committed by the Saudi government, whether we're talking about assassinations of journalists like Khashoggi, or we're talking about violation of human rights of women in Saudi Arabia, or we're talking about promoting terror and war abroad, as in Yemen, against civilian populations. So I think that, again, the progressive outlook on this is now dominant within the majority caucus, and we're not going to be afraid to take them on. And so I think that is one of the hot spots that we're going to have to be dealing with. And we've got a very strong interest in human rights and peace. And those things converge on that issue to say we want peace for the people of Yemen, stop the Saudi war on Yemen, and defend the human rights of people in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia itself. I mean, which remains, one of the leading administrators of capital punishment on earth, which does not accept any religious freedom or tolerance, that basically respects nobody's human rights, tramples the rights of women. I guess women can now get their learner's permit for driving. I'm not sure if they're allowed to get their license yet, but it's that kind of stuff.
Yeah. What are your views on the Iran nuclear deal?
I think we got to get back to that Iran nuclear deal. I think, as we foresaw, getting out of the deal would lead to real instability and could only strengthen the hardliners in Iran.
Absolutely.
Who want to be on a nuclear path. I mean, there are forces in the world that really seem to have a death wish for humanity, that want us to be on the path to war, and we've got to turn that around and say, no, we're not going to be committed to war. We're going to be committed to peace, and we're going to be committed to expanding human rights and democracy for everybody.
On the Palestinian front, the Palestinian-Israeli front, what is your sense about the influence of AIPAC today in Congress? I know AIPAC had a huge influence in Congress. Recently, I think you may have even signed on a letter that AIPAC put out that said that Israel aid should never have any conditions attached to it, or something along those lines. Can you give me an idea of what is the influence of AIPAC today? And I know that there's been other organizations that have come up that have, put a little bit of a buffer to what AIPAC has been able to do.
Well, first of all, there are restrictions on aid to Israel in the Memorandum of Understanding. I mean, that's already built into the aid that Israel gets, like every other recipient of foreign aid gets. There are restrictions attached. So the idea that there can't be restrictions, just, that doesn't make sense. But yeah, I mean, I think you're referring to J Street. That there's a way in which AIPAC was, the mouthpiece for the most right-wing Republican forces, including those, by the way, who have a kind of messianic Christian commitment to Israel as the location of Armageddon and the final showdown. I mean, there's a whole theological school about how Israel needs to be supported because that is going to be essentially the site of World War III, and where basically the followers of Jesus will be taken up and everybody else will live in tribulation and 1,000 years or 10,000 years of war and so on. I mean, we've really got to make sure that our foreign policy is guided by reason and diplomacy and not by messianic religious forces all over the world, and theocracies all over the world, like Saudi Arabia. So I think that J Street has played a positive role in countering that kind of right-wing Republican takeover of the AIPAC position, and advocating for peaceful diplomatic resolution of the conflict there, dealing with the rights of the Palestinians as a community, securing Israel's right to exist and to be able to defend itself against foreign states, and trying to find peace in that totally besieged part of the world.
Mm-hmm. Betty McCollum recently put out a bill, introduced a bill, I believe it's the HR 2590, if I'm not mistaken. It's promoting human rights for Palestinian children living under Israeli military occupation. And, Human Rights Watch has documented the detention and beating of an interrogation, coercion and interrogation of children as young as 11, and recently CNN even wrote a report about them detaining a 9-year-old on their way to school. Is that something that is having any traction in Congress these days, or I spoke to a Palestinian activist not very long ago, and they said it feels like America has too many things to deal with, and they're sort of forgotten about us. What is your sense about where we are on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and trying to really bring about some real honest peace and progress in that regard?
Well, I think your friend is right that it's hard to get traction on anything other than what is currently the administration agenda. And they are going very methodically, and rightfully so, to say, okay, we're going to get $1.9 trillion in aid through the American Rescue Plan to the American people. And now we're going to do gun violence, and we're going to focus on that. And now we're going to move to the infrastructure plan, and we're going to do that. And so by proceeding in that way, the public understands what's going on, and that's working. So it does make it far more difficult for issues, especially very controversial issues, where you can get lots of ideological crossfire, and we've not been able to build a common ground. But having said that, I think that within the Democratic caucus, there is obviously strong support for Israel's right to exist and defend itself, and also strong support for peace and human rights for Palestinians living in the West Bank and living in Gaza, and observance of international human rights norms. And so somehow we've got to try to extract real peace and progress in that part of the world. I have a lot more confidence in Secretary of State Blinken and the people in the Biden administration, obviously, than I do in Jared Kushner and the other members of the Trump family who decided they wanted to redesign the Middle East according to the dictates of Saudi Arabia and Bibi Netanyahu and the most right-wing forces in the region.
As we come to the end of this conversation, of course, COVID is around, and it's still ravaging communities. Where does Maryland stand on vaccination, and particularly your district?
Well, I was part of a push with my friends in the county council, president of the council, Hucker, and Mark Elridge, to get a mass vaccination site, which we now have, the Up County in Germantown. So, which is good because people were having to travel to Baltimore and so on. It was very tough for working people who couldn't get off for the day. So that's good. And I think that we are, because of that, we're accelerating the numbers of people who are getting vaccinated. I mean, our big obstacle now is vaccine hesitancy in some places. We have a lot of our community health clinics that are out there, like Maria's Center. We are out there going into communities with vans and with outreach just to get people the vaccine. So I think that there are very aggressive efforts to find the hotspots and get people vaccinated. But we've just got to spread the word that everybody's getting vaccinated, and we need everybody to be.
What do you tell people? What do you tell people that just don't trust the vaccine? I know many friends. I know particularly people of color, Black folks in this country, just have a mistrust about the intentions of this vaccine and the effect of it. And, particularly now with the clots are coming out of Johnson & Johnson that add a little bit more shade to the whole issue. And I know that's been removed, and they've went ahead now with it. But I just, what do you tell people? How do you convince people who do not trust government and trust the vaccine to go ahead and get it?
Well, I think you tell people, look, first of all, it is a new vaccine. So we haven't, it's not been around like the measles vaccine for decades. But having said that, hundreds of millions of people have gotten it. It's so doctors and nurses are getting it, and all of my Democratic colleagues are getting, including all the members of the Congressional Black Caucus and the Hispanic Caucus. The people who are having real hesitance, there are two groups of people who are being hesitant, Andy. Some of them are buying right-wing Republican propaganda about how this is, George Soros is trying to infect you or something like that. Those people are not going to be convinced. But then they're the kind of people you're talking about who are just saying, I don't know, I don't know a lot about it. I tend to be skeptical of, big science or whatever. And there, I think they just need to talk to people who've gotten it, who are totally fine. Yeah, your arm can feel sore for a little while, especially on the second shot. Some people feel under the weather for a few hours, but people are coming back fine. And then you're vaccinated, and that's going to enable us to build the real herd immunity that we need so we can get back to business and get back to work.
Yes, and we all need to do that. I miss having these types of gatherings face to face. I know it means so much more, and there's so much more human. I guess Zoom and StreamYard and all these can only go so far. But I miss the ability to be able to stand next to people and chat with them, and create all kinds of connections that otherwise wouldn't happen just online. So thank you for all of that, and thank you for taking this hour with us. I know you've been extremely busy. We are so proud of what you do. Honestly, you make us all look good. Thank you. And one last question before you leave that I ask everyone is, imagine a dinner you're having after COVID, where you don't have to wear a mask, and you want to invite anybody from history, past, present, whatever. And you want to have it, and you can have more than one person. Who would you invite at your table?
Well, you got to have Frederick Douglass, who's the great revolutionary Democrat of Maryland's history, who did so much to change America and fight for a strong democratic constitution and fight for people in Maryland and people in D.C., which is why the new state would bear his name. Of course, I love Tom Paine, who came from abroad to fight with us against the kings and queens, was an early abolitionist, knew that slavery would come to bedevil the republic if we didn't deal with it right at the beginning, which obviously we didn't. But he thought that America could become an asylum to humanity, a refuge for people fleeing from political and religious and economic repression from all over the world. Not an insane asylum, but an asylum for humanity, a democratic asylum. I would love to see him. I would love to see the great Harriet Tubman, who showed so much courage in creating the Underground Railroad out of Maryland, but kept coming back to make us stronger. I don't know if you heard the song that we wrote for Maryland, and
I did.
Steve Jones and I did. But those are sort of the heroes, of our song.
I would imagine you'd invite de Tocqueville as well, Alexis de Tocqueville in there.
No, he was a little bit of an aristocrat snob.
Yeah. He'd be interesting just to pick his brain.
Yeah. Lincoln to me is just a fascinating figure, a really important figure, who did come out to Silver Spring several times. That's where Montgomery Blair, his postmaster general, was. And Lincoln, of course, was out at Fort Stevens and was, standing tall up on a horse, and everybody could see him. And Oliver Wendell Holmes pulled him down and said, "Get down, you fool." So Lincoln is somebody who, it would be pretty cool to get a chance to meet. But I got to tell you, we've been through a hell of a time, Andy, and you've been a hero to me. And there's so many people in our community who've been heroes in this resistance to right-wing authoritarianism. They're trying to keep the trajectory of democracy moving in the right direction. And I'm amazed about a lot of the people that I get to serve with in Congress, and a new generation of political leaders that I'm very fond of.
Thank you. And on a personal level, I would love for you to sign on to Betty McCollum's bill. But
I appreciate that. I will check it out. I've not read the new version of her bill, and I will definitely check it out.
Please do. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you. Best to you and your family. We love you. Take care of yourself.
Thank you, Andy.
All you folks out there, we're gonna have a conversation about the book 400 Souls next week, and we urge you to come and join us for that next week on Friday. Until then, peace and love and all good stuff. Thank you very much.